So does anybody have any questions about anything that's coming up? Everybody who's here has the paper 2 assignment now, right? Okay, anybody have any questions about it before we move on? Okay, so for next time, remember that you're reading the first 99 pages of the Parable of the Sower. And Bethany, you are going to be peopling Grace's region, right? So make sure that you have everything you need from her before you leave today. All right, so let's start with this issue of the shadow. What is the shadow?
I feel like it could be like a physical embodiment of like Ged's inner demons and fears.
Okay. Okay. What leads you to draw that conclusion, Grace? Why do you think it's a representation of Ged's inner demons?
Well, when I was reading, I was kind of thinking about like trying to think ahead. Like I was kind of like, I wonder if that's just like Ged's evil self, his shadow.
Okay.
I could not, this entire time, I could not stop thinking about Frankenstein. This is literally just like a different font of Frankenstein. I don't know. But, and then when he finally called it by its name, that was like how he really just like defeated it. And they like, I was like, huh.
Yeah, he has to not just call it by its name, but embrace it, right?
Yeah.
And then once the two embrace, right, there's only one remaining. There's only one left. And I think that there are some hints as to what the shadow is, like going back much, much further, right? So, for example, when the sailor Skior attacks Ged on the island of Oskill, right? Skior has been taken over by the shadow. And what does the shadow do then to rob Ged of his power? Yeah, the shadow knows Ged's name, right? Right, how, right? Skior clearly didn't know it, right? The guy that the shadow took over. And, you know, there would not have been any particular opportunity for the shadow to know Ged's name unless it also happened to be the shadow's name, right? And when Ged is chasing the shadow across the ocean, what form does it take? What does it look like? Yeah, it looks like him, right? There are all these, like, you know, when he lands on Ifish, his friend Vetch seems to think that he'd seen him a few days before, right? And there are these other reports of, you know, a man who looks like Ged, like just walking through things and walking over the water, right? So when he shows up, for example, on that other island, they don't want him to stick around, right? It's like, yeah, here's some stuff, you now go, right? Get away from here. So yeah, the shadow knows Ged's name, and the shadow takes Ged's shape. When it has an opportunity to take a form of its own, right? And I think that even some of this is hinted at in kind of like the personality change that Ged undergoes after summoning the shadow, right? He becomes much less arrogant, much less prideful, right? Many of those negative characteristics that mark the character in the early part of the novel are basically gone for the rest of the book, right? And I think, yeah, that a lot of that is perhaps because, as you suggested, it's all kind of externalized into this shadow form. Now, when we talked about Frankenstein, did I throw this word at you? Yeah? Okay, I thought so. But yeah, I think, yeah, this is a really kind of similar situation where the shadow is this dark double that all of Ged's negative qualities are projected onto. And the two of them have to pursue one another, right? And I think it looked like much of the book is built around these kind of various kinds of doubling, right? Like even to think back to the whole yin-yang idea and the notion of everything being in some sense defined by its opposite, but also containing within it its opposite.
So would you say he becomes definitively balanced whenever he combines with his double?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's the idea. Yeah, and I think it's not just Ged that becomes balanced when he reunites with his double. I think that there are a number of other forces that are balanced out in the same moment, right? So, for example, let's think for a minute about this stone that Ged encounters on the island of Oskil, the Terranon, right? Now, do you ever recall anything about this stone, about the Terranon? What is it?
It was something was trapped in it and was really bad. At least to get something really bad.
Yeah, there's some kind of evil force trapped in this stone,
Super
right?
powerful.
Yeah, and that has been trying to lure him to it, to make him his slave, right? To make him its slave, right? So if we turn to the chapter, The Hawk's Flight, about halfway through, the passage that starts with, let's actually start with the passage that starts with, the old lord kept mostly in his own apartments. If we can find that, if somebody wants to read that for us.
The old lord kept mostly in his own apartments, coming forth mornings to pace up and down the snowy inner courtyards of the castle keep like an old sorcerer who has been brewing spells all night. When he joined Guin and Seren for supper, he sat silent, looking up at his young wife sometimes with a hard, covetous glance. Then Guin pitied her. She was like a white deer caged, like a white bird wing clipped, like a silver ring on an old man's finger. She was an item of Benaresk's hoard. When the lord of the keep left them, Guin stayed with her, trying to cheer her solitude as she had cheered his.
Okay, so let's kind of start here and like think about like what this tells us about the atmosphere of this particular court, right? So we have this old Lord Benderesk, right, who is the lord of the court of the Terranon, and a young wife, Seren. And what does this passage tell us about the relationship between these two?
She has like no powers and she's like being controlled by him.
Yeah, okay, that she is in some sense under his control, right? And what else? How does he seem to think of her?
As an idol.
Yeah, she's a thing, right? She's a pretty treasure for his hoard, right? So Benderesk here is almost like a dragon, right? Like the dragon that Ged had faced on Pendor. So that should tell us something, that should at least give us some suspicion about this jewel that he keeps under his castle, right? That something in this place isn't quite right. So can we continue here from what is this jewel that gives your keep its name?
What is this jewel that gives your keep its name? He asked her. As they sat talking over the empty gold plates and gold goblets in the cavernous, candlelit dining hall. You have not heard of it. It is a famous thing. No, I know only the lords of Osco have famous treasuries. Ah, this jewel outshines them all. Come, would you like to see it? She smiled with a look of mockery and daring, as if a little afraid of what she did, and led the young man from the hall, out through the narrow corridors of the base of the tower, and downstairs underground to a locked door he had not seen before. This she unlocked with a silver key, looking up at Guin with the same smile as she did so, as if she dared him to come on with her. Beyond the door was a short passage and a second door, which she unlocked with a gold key. Beyond that again, a third door, which she unlocked with one of the great words of unbinding. Within that last door, her candle showed them a small room like a dungeon cell, floor, walls, ceiling, all rough stone, unfurnished blank. Do you see it? Sir asked. As Ged looked around the room, his wizard's eye caught one stone of those that made the floor. It was a rough, dank as the rest, a heavy, unshapen paving stone. Yet he felt the power of it as if it spoke to him aloud.
Okay, let's pause there for a second, right? And think about what we discussed last time in terms of Taoist symbolism. Do we remember anything in particular about, the rough stone or the uncarved block?
There's more value or more balance in something that is unshaped, unused. There's potential to it.
Yeah, exactly. The thing that is not yet shaped, right? The thing that has not yet been made use of is filled with potential. And that potential is power, right? So the Terranon seems to be a kind of Taoist object in that it's uncarved, right? It hasn't been shaped. But the power it contains is an evil and a dangerous power, right? And his breath caught in his throat, and a sickness came over him for a moment. This was the founding stone of the tower. This was the central place, and it was cold, bitter cold. Nothing could ever warm the little room. This was a very ancient thing. An old and terrible spirit was prisoned in that block of stone. He did not answer Surette yes or no, but stood still, and presently, with a curious glance at him, she pointed out the stone. That is the Terranon. Do you wonder that we keep so precious a jewel locked away in our deepest hoard room? So let's think about the kinds of sensations here that Ged is associating with the stone thus far. What does the stone make him feel?
Cold.
Cold, yeah. Cold, dark. Still, Ged did not answer, but stood dumb and wary. She might almost have been testing him, but he thought she had no notion of the stone's nature to speak of it so lightly. She did not know enough of it to fear it. Tell me of its powers, he said at last. It was made before Seaboy raised the islands of the world from the open sea. It was made when the world itself was made and will endure until the end of the world. Time is nothing to it. If you lay your hand upon it and ask a question of it, it will answer according to the power that is in you. It has a voice if you know how to listen. It will speak of things that were and are and will be. It told of your coming long before you came to this land. Will you ask a question of it now? So in her description of the stone, what theme do we notice in Surette's description of the stone?
That it's wise, that it'll answer your questions.
Okay, it's wise, it'll answer your questions, right? But there is also a certain tact to it as well, right? It was made before Seagoy raised the islands of the world from the open sea. So it predates the creation of Earthsea, right? Time is nothing to it. Right? It will speak of things that were and are and will be. It was made when the world itself was made and will endure until the end of the world. What do we notice here about how she's describing the stone kind of thematically?
It's almost like it could be their god. Like it was there before everything.
Okay, yeah. Like an object of worship, right? But there's an important quality that it shares here with a god. And I want you to think particularly about that sentence, time is nothing to it.
It's immortal.
Yeah, this is like everything here is about like permanence, right? Eternity. And these are forces that the novel seems to associate generally with earth and with stone. It's also, I think, important to note that the Terranon is a prison, right? There's a force that is imprisoned within it. Right, so remember that Ged generally seems to, and wizards generally here seem to feel more comfortable out on the water, right? So there's an opposition here in the text between earth and water, where earth represents these kinds of forces, but is also like typically associated with death and with evil. And I think that associating permanence with death actually makes a certain kind of sense, right? And associating water with change and with life also makes a certain kind of sense, right? In what way is death perhaps easily associated with permanence? What's the logic there?
There's no return from it.
Yeah, that's basically when you stop changing, right? Right, that's it. Whereas life is a continual process of change. And magic being itself a kind of continual process of change, right? Good magic, or at least morally neutral magic, seems to be associated primarily with water. Right? Note, for example, that one of the most valuable skills of wizards here is weatherworking. So, I want to take us actually back a little ways to another passage that I think illustrates this association. It is in chapter chapter 5. And this is when Ged is trying to bring back his friend Pechvari's son from the land of the dead, right? Trying to stop the little boy's spirit from crossing over And I want to look at the way the land of the dead here is described. So can I get somebody to start reading from, it's in chapter 5, it's the paragraph that starts, summoning his power all at once and with no thought for himself. Okay, page 95, thank you, Grace.
Summoning his power all at once and with no thought for himself, he sent his spirit out after the child's spirit, to bring it back home. He called the child's name, Ioeth. Thinking some faint answer came in his inward hearing, he pursued, calling once more. Then he saw the little boy running fast and far ahead of him down a dark slope, the side of some vast hill. There was no sound. The stars above the hill were no stars his eyes had ever seen. Yet he knew the constellations by name. The sheep, the door, the one who turns, the tree. They were those stars that do not set, that are not paled by the coming of any day. He had followed the dying child too far.
Yeah, just.
Knowing this, he found himself alone on the dark hillside. It was hard to turn back, very hard. He turned slowly. Slowly he set one foot forward to climb back up the hill, and then the other. Step by step he went, each step little, and each step was harder than the last. The stars did not move. No wind blew over the dry, steep ground. In all the vast kingdom of the darkness, only he moved, slowly climbing. He came to the top of the hill and saw the low wall of stones there. But across the wall, facing him, there was a shadow. The shadow did not have the shape of a man or a beast. It was shapeless, scarcely to be seen, but it whispered at him, though there were no words in its whispering, and it reached out towards him. And it stood on the side of the living, and he on the side of the dead. Either he must go down the hill into the desert lands and lightless cities of the dead, or he must step across the wall back into life, where the formless evil thing waited for him.
Okay, thank you. So, first off, what do we notice about the way the land of the dead is described? What does the land of the dead look like here?
There was no wind.
Uh-huh.
The stars did not move.
Yep, no wind, unmoving stars. Good.
Overall, nothing is moving except him.
Yeah, nothing moves, right? Nothing.
The vast wasteland.
What's that?
It's like a vast wasteland.
Yeah, it's also, it's dry, right? And it's always night, right? Those stars never set. So again, there's an association here between earth and land, right? And this permanent state of death. Now there are two things that I want to point out here. The first thing I want to do is actually go back to something we read a long time ago, that in which I think we'll find something comparable to what we're going to see at the end of the novel, right? So I'm going to take a minute back to Homer's Odyssey, which is similar to a Wizard of Earthsea in regards to the treatment of death in two ways, right? So we know that a Wizard of Earthsea includes a scene of Nicaea, right? Do we all remember what Nicaea was?
That was a ritual to speak to the dead.
Yeah, that's the summoning of the dead, right? Right, when Ged conjures up the spirit of Elfarin on Roke Knoll, right, he is performing Nicaea, right? But it also includes a scene of, actually two scenes, arguably, of Catabasis, right? Do we remember what Catabasis was? It's It's related to Nicaea, but it's not the same thing.
It's a journey through the land of or hell or land of the dead to
Yeah.
get some sort of information.
Yeah, Catabasis is the journey into the land of the dead. Good. So I just want to take a minute with Homer and look at the way the path to the land of the dead is described by Circe. Right? Odysseus asks Circe, right? Circe, who can pilot us on that journey? Who has ever reached the house of death in a black ship? The lustrous goddess answered, never pausing. Royal son of Laertes, Odysseus, born for exploits, let no lack of a pilot at the helm concern you. No, just step your mast and spread your white sail wide. Sit back and the north wind will speed you on your way. But once your vessel has cut across the ocean river, right, that is the river that encircles the entire world, you will raise a desolate coast in Persephone's grove, her tall black poplars, willows whose fruit dies young. Beach your vessel hard by the ocean's churning shore and make your own way down to the moldering house of death. So beyond the river that encircles all of the earth, right, there is one more patch of dry land that you can land on to reach the house of the dead. Now, we are no longer looking over Ged's shoulder at the very end of the novel. We're sitting with Vetch as he watches what happens to Ged. And if we turn to, it's in the last chapter. It's the paragraph that starts with Vetch seeing only the waves heaving up and down clear to the end of sight. It's near the end.
Vetch, seeing only the waves
Thank you.
heaving up and down clear to the end of sight, could not understand why they went now by oars. But he waited, and presently he was aware that the world's wind was growing faint and the swells diminishing. The climb and plunge of the boat grew less and less, till at last she seemed to go forward under Ged's strong oar strokes over water that lay almost still, as in a landlocked bay. And though Vetch could not see what Ged saw, when between his strokes he looked ever and again over his shoulder at what lay before the boat's way. Though Vetch could not see the dark slopes beneath unmoving stars, yet he began to see with his wizard's eye a darkness that built up in the hollows of the waves all around the boat. And he saw the billows grow low and sluggish as they were choked by sand. If this were an enchantment of illusion, it was powerful beyond belief to make the open sea seem land. Trying to collect his wits and courage, Vetch spoke the revelation spell, watching between each slow syllable word for change or tremor of illusion in this strange drying and shallowing of the abyss of ocean. But there was none. Perhaps the spell, though it should affect only his own vision and not the magic at work about them, had no power here. Or perhaps there was no illusion, and they had come to the world's end. Unheeding, Ged rowed always slower, looking over his shoulder, choosing a way among channels or shoals and shallows that he alone could see. The boat shuddered as her keel dragged. Under that keel lay the vast deeps of the sea, yet they were aground. Ged drew the oars up, rattling in their locks, and that noise was terrible, for there was no other sound. All sounds of water, wind, wood, sail were gone, lost in a huge, profound silence that might have been unbroken forever. The boat lay motionless. No breath of wind moved. The sea had turned to sand, shadowy, unstirred. Nothing moved in the dark sky or on that dry, unreal ground that went on and together in darkness, all around the boat as far as I could see.
Okay, thank you. So, where are they, or where does it look like they are?
The end of the world.
Yeah, they're at the end of they've rowed basically as far as you can row, right? They have passed by the last known island. And where have they ended up? Here at the end of the world. What does this place look suspiciously like?
Everything's still and unmoving and you can't hear anything, so I imagine
Yes.
it's the land of the dead.
Yeah.
Eerily like it.
What's that?
I said it looks, or eerily looks like the land of the dead.
Yeah, this is very, very similar, at the very least, to Ged's experience of the land of the dead, right? Which in future, I don't think it's referred to by this name in this particular book, but in future Earthsea novels, it is actually called the Dry Land.
Is it dead?
Well, what do you think? Do y'all think that I mean, he's brought Vetch with him, right? And Vetch is experiencing the same thing. At least, in a sensory sense. Although Vetch actually seems to be maybe experiencing something slightly different from Ged, right? Because Ged keeps rowing, and Vetch is the one who's seeing all of this appear around them, right? We don't actually know what Ged is seeing.
It's just a bystander.
Yeah. Well, actually, I mean, Ged is actually the active one here, right? He's the one doing something, but Vetch is just sitting back watching his friend and not really understanding what's going on, right? But, yeah, they seem to have found themselves right back here. And yet somehow it's also still water, right? Somehow the boat still rows.
That's what I was confused about. Like,
Yeah.
trying to picture it in my head as I was reading, I was like picturing like a sandbar in the middle of the ocean, kind of.
Uh-huh.
Vetch was like sinking in quicksand, kind of, when he got out.
Yeah. Well, and why is he actually sinking in quicksand?
I don't know.
Because it's still actually water, right? They are still actually out in the middle of the ocean.
Yeah, that's where I was confused. Like,
Uh-huh.
I knew they're in the ocean, but then there's like sand and like they're able to like what he's seeing. So I was like picturing a sandbar, but I don't think that's actually what it was.
Yeah.
But I didn't know what to picture in my head
Yeah.
in this scene.
And
Like, was it the ocean and it was just an illusion, or I don't know.
I don't think it's necessarily an illusion. I think what's happening here is it's kind of like they get to a place where the spiritual world and the physical world kind of overlap and are overlaid on top of each other.
Right.
And because, perhaps because they're wizards, and perhaps because of the nature of Ged's quest, what they're seeing is the spiritual world, which seems to overlay the physical world in all places. Ged is able to enter it, for example, from the island of Low Torning as well, to go and try to fetch his friend's son back from the dead. But yeah, here at the end, they are at the end of the world. And what kind of space would the end of the world be? If we think back to previous lessons, and things that are both one thing and another, and yet are neither.
I think it would look endless, but it's not. Like, it is
Uh-huh.
the end, but
Yeah.
it seems endless.
Yeah, but even at the end, there still seems to be something there, right? They don't quite reach the end. I'm just going to throw this word back up here. Yeah, what they do when they reach the end of the end of the world is they find themselves in liminal space, right? They're between this world and the next.
Yeah, I was about to say, it kind of seems like another dimension.
Uh-huh.
It's like a
Yeah.
different dimension, like, you're between Earth and between the afterlife.
Yeah, and it is. They're kind of, yeah, I mean, the afterlife in the way it's imagined here does literally seem to be basically another plane or another dimension, right? Like kind of overlaid on top of this one, or below it, or whatever, right? As opposed to, like, say, you know, the Greek underworld and the Roman underworld are supposed to be physical places on the globe, right? Or underneath the globe. Yeah, in this case, yeah, we're talking about a different plane or dimension of existence here. And they seem to be on both simultaneously. Here at the end of things, where Ged is about to meet, finally, his shadow. And I think it might also help us in thinking about this if we think exactly about what the nature of a shadow is.
It's the absence of something.
Okay.
I guess I was thinking of a Nazgul kind of deal.
What's that?
I guess I was thinking of a Nazgul kind of deal.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I guess when we think back to the Tolkien stuff, yeah, they're like a Nazgul is like kind of like literally like something kind of ripped out of the fabric of existence, right? It's a void. And I think that a shadow is kind of similar in a sense, right? But what does there have to be in order for a shadow to exist?
Light.
There has to be light, yeah. And what else?
Something that blocks it?
Yeah, there has to be something blocking that light, right? There has to be an object to cast that shadow. And the shadow is positioned where in relation to you, typically?
Opposite of the sun.
Opposite of the sun, yeah. And usually kind of we think of your shadow as kind of following behind you, right? And I think there is a relationship here with Frankenstein that I think we can probably talk about productively in a second here. But I think that this also has something to do with the overall kind of pattern of Ged's journey, right? When he first leaves Roke, who's the pursuer and who's the pursued?
The shadow's following him.
Yeah, the shadow is initially following him, right? So in order to actually do something about the shadow, what does he have to do?
Follow it.
He has to chase it, right? He has to kind of reverse the direction of nature there and actually actively pursue the shadow, right? And when he begins to pursue it, it runs from him, right? Because that's, kind of like, that's the way a shadow works, right? Your shadow, on the one hand, like it's always attached to you, but it's always either you're following it and you can't catch up, or it's following you and it can't catch up, right? You can never be in the same place as your shadow, exactly. It's always going to be before or behind you. And I think, yeah, once he takes the initiative and starts pursuing it, and he has to takes the shadow into himself finally, right? This is the resolution that Victor Frankenstein never reaches, right? But Frankenstein makes a similar, there's a similar trajectory in that novel, right? And this is what I keep thinking, since you pointed this out last time, Grace, I keep thinking that there's a more intentional resemblance between this and Frankenstein than I'd ever realized. and that there's probably something in this. But yeah, there's the same basic pattern in that novel, right? Where the creature chases Victor for most of the novel, and then Victor turns around and chases the creature out into the Arctic, right? So yeah, I think there are some really, really interesting and telling parallels there. But since it was your idea, and I don't want to steal it from you, let you draw that out as you will. But, so there are a couple of maybe one more big point that I want to hit here. But what are y'all thinking about all this? Do y'all have particular questions or particular things you wanted to ask about or talk about? Because I can just happily go on.
I guess if the shadow is a symbolization, let's just say, of his Ged's fears or inner demons or whatever, that it's chasing him around. Why, I guess, would it have started? But I don't know if it has something to do with wizardry or something, but it initially started when he had first, he was super scared. He saw that thing in the door when he was with Ogion.
Yeah.
That's when it first started, and then that Ogion dealt with it though.
Yeah.
Do you think that could have been a preface of what was a foreshadow of what was to come of that? Do you think
foreshadow.
Do you think that shadow was that same?
Absolutely. Because even when he's on Roke Knoll and he's remembering the summoning spell, right? He's thinking back to that time when Ogion's book seemed to be reading itself to him, right? And some hand other than his own seemed to be guiding the pages. So yeah, I think it's absolutely the same shadow, and I think it's also worth noting who Surette turns out to be. Right. Surette, the woman who leads him down to talk to the Pteranodon, right, was that Lord's daughter who dared him to show her some powerful magic, right? And kind of stirred up his pride and arrogance, right?
I knew something was off with her.
Well, and she's she's in both cases not necessarily acting at her own behest either, right? We're told, when she is a girl on Gaunt, that her mother, who is a witch, wants to spy out Ogion's secrets. And in this case, she's basically forced to do her husband's bidding, right? So in neither case is she acting independently, but in both cases she is acting as a kind of lure to Ged, to get him to give himself up.
So was Ogion aware that he would be fighting against himself and he was trying to keep him distracted in the beginning?
I'm not sure about the beginning, but I think actually the last part of this that I really wanted to look at was his second major interaction with Ogion when he returns from the court of the Pteranodon.
Just hearing about that makes me think that he was trying to keep the evil side of him at bay and keeping him distracted, which is why he never, I guess, taught him magic. And that made him get really frustrated.
Well, I think that we also have to, Ged gets frustrated with Ogion's teachings, right? Because Ogion's teachings are primarily about patience and conserving your energy. And what's that?
I was the Karate Kid when I was reading that.
Mr. Miyagi, yeah, it's like, yeah, teaching a generation of American kids, yeah, it's like, you know, when you're waxing your dad's car, you're actually learning karate.
Maybe he was trying to teach him patience, like you're learning it too fast. You're going to do something you shouldn't be doing.
Yeah, well, and I think, like again, like most of the lessons that Ged is actually taught, right, are about patience and caution and care, right? You know, if you know his discussion on rope with the master hand, you know, the guy tells him, like, look, like, you know, I know you want to change a rock into a diamond, right, and make it permanent, but a rock is a good thing too. And, you know, learning patience and maturity before, you know, acquiring power, I think is, you know, the basic method of wizards in this particular world, right? They're very much concerned with balance and with equilibrium and with not upsetting the balance, right? I think there's some point in the novel where somebody says, like, okay, like if you want rain on rope, you have to take it from somewhere, right? So rain on rope means drought on Gaunt, or, you know, whatever, right? That you always have to think through what the ripple effects of whatever you're doing are going to be.
Yeah, it did seem a little power hungry.
Well, and you know, I mean, he's also like, you know, he's a kid, right? When he is at his most arrogant and power hungry, right? You know, he's a kid, and he's not just a kid, right? He's a gifted kid, right? He's an especially talented kid who feels like all of these adults are holding him back. And he's like, why the fuck don't you just let me do my thing, right? You know, let me exercise my power. Again, like not unlike Victor Frankenstein, right? You know, who's, you know, young, intelligent, and less bothered by some of his teachers by qualms of morality than they would like him to be, right? So I think what happens when he meets Ogion again is a kind of rebirth, right? Into someone who is capable of hunting down and defeating that shadow self, right? Of reincorporating that shadow into himself. Right, so if we go to the end of the Hawk's Flight chapter, right? So he's in hawk shape. He has returned and shifted his shape, right? The paragraph that starts with, Ged was richly and outlandishly dressed in fur and silk and silver, and he's wearing the courtier's clothes from Oskill. But the clothes were torn and stiff with sea salt, and he stood gaunt and stooped, his hair lank about his scarred face. Ogion took the soiled princely cloak off his shoulders, led him to the alcove room where his prentice once had slept, and made him lie down on the pallet there. And so with a murmured sleep charm left him. He had said no word to him, knowing that Ged had no human speech in him now. As a boy, Ogion, like all boys, had thought it would be a very pleasant game to take by art magic whatever shape one liked, man or beast, tree or cloud, and so to play it being 1,000 beings. But as a wizard, he had learned the price of the game, which is the peril of losing oneself, playing away the truth. The longer a man stays in a form not his own, the greater this peril. Every prentice sorcerer learns the tale of the wizard Borger of Way, who delighted in taking bear shape, and did so more and more often, until the bear grew in him and the man died away, and he became a bear, and killed his own little son in the forests, and was hunted down and slain. And no one knows how many of the dolphins that leap in the waters of the inmost sea were men once, wise men, who forgot their wisdom and their name in the joy of the restless sea. So I think like there's like on the literal level here, what's the lesson that Ogion is thinking of?
Don't take shape of an animal for too long, you'll become that.
Yeah, if you spend too long in a shape not your own, you become that thing, right? And think about where Ged has been and what he's wearing when he comes back to Ogion's hut, right? He has also been walking around in a shape not his own. And by returning to Ogion, he's returning to his roots, right? As a Gontish peasant boy. And so, Ogion is helping to restore, like, not just his physical human form, but also his memory of who he really is and what he really is, which is what he needs in order to go off and defeat the shadow, since the shadow is, as we've already determined, a part of him. So he can't know the shadow and thus defeat the shadow until he knows himself again. Yeah, go ahead.
So, when he was doing the summoning spell, that's another thing I was a little confused about, was like, isn't the summoning spell supposed to bring someone back from the, or like someone from the dead? Like, why didn't that work for him? Why was it just his own shadow?
Well, it did, right? He did summon the Shade of Elfarin.
Right.
He just brought this other thing along with it.
Okay.
Because he didn't really know what he was doing yet, right?
Yeah, because he saw that woman.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. He didn't. Yeah, so yeah, the Nakia does actually work. It does happen. But because he's doing it not for any good purpose, but out of pride, because, you know, Jasper is goaded, he's let Jasper goad him into it, that taints the spell, and he releases that dangerous energy into the world as well. Me too. This is like I mean, this is like one of my kind of like longtime personal favorites. It's one that I go back to a lot. The whole series is actually quite good. There's a series. There's the book that follows this, The Tombs of Atuan, I think is actually in some ways better than this one.
Ged is not in all of them.
What's that?
I thought it'd be The Adventures of Ged, but he's not in the second book.
Well, he actually is in the second book,
Really?
but he only appears halfway through it. And like so, this is the only book in the series, or at least in the original trilogy that Guin wrote, that is pretty much so like where Ged is the perspective character. In the following two books, we see Ged through someone else's eyes. They're still primarily about his deeds and his actions, but instead of like us following along the young wizard as he figures himself out, we're watching two other younger characters than Ged follow him along and learn things about themselves, right? So all of the novels follow the basic model of what's called the Bildungsroman. Now, I don't know if you've had this word in other classes. Anybody familiar with it? Okay, so it's a German word, right? Roman means novel, and Bildung means development. Right? Because the Germans love their big, long, clunky compound words. So a Bildungsroman literally is a novel of development. And you know, it's a term that is applied to just about any kind of, you know, coming of age or initiation sort of tale, right? And this particular novel is, it's not just about Ged becoming a wizard, but also about Ged growing up and reaching maturity and reaching the insight that comes with maturity. And in the following two novels, we're kind of dealing with the perspective character in the second novel is a Kargish priestess who finds Ged rooting around in her temple and has to figure out what to do with him. And then in the third, Ged is a middle-aged man, and he's on a quest with a young prince whose attitude towards Ged vacillates between admiration and frustration at the older man's inaction on certain things, right? But yeah, they're all worth checking out. All right, any other questions? All right, let me give you the guide questions for next time. We're going to be moving on to a novel that has become more disturbing as history has moved forward. Let's just say that some of the predictions about the early 21st century that Octavia Butler was making in the 1990s weren't that far off.
I'm dead convinced that